All right, hello everybody. Today, when I did the first video last week, I didn't think of the title Lessons from My First Novel, but this is going to be Lessons from My First Novel Part 2, and we're going to be focusing on the idea of making an epic story, or making really high stakes, and we're going to look at kind of some of the downsides of that approach, because it does seem to be really common. You've got a lot of modern fantasy and science fiction that kind of pursue these very epic stories. Not just stories of like once in a lifetime, but stories of once in several generations, perhaps. And there's nothing wrong with, of course, there's nothing wrong with attempting to and succeeding at writing an epic story, but there are some downsides to the form that I think are worth thinking about a little bit in your own, writing or reading adventures. So, let's imagine that there's a story, and let's imagine that it's a good story that's written about some kind of thousand-year empire that's taken down by, that's eventually taken down by some group of people or something like that. Then, they overthrow the empire and they come to power, and well, then there's, it's well done, and the book is popular, and the book sells a lot. And the incentive, or maybe the idea that the author gets is, well, I need to do another epic story. Let's have something else epic happen to these people and have them have to deal with something crazy. And the problem is that if the previous empire lasted for 1,000 years and was taken down by this small group of people or whatever, then there's all these other groups waiting in the wings to go after this smaller group of people. It's going to be kind of hard to understand or to justify why those groups that have been waiting in the wings didn't jump up earlier and kind of use their own power that, by definition must be kind of on par with the group that did the original overthrow, and kind of win there. It can be done, right? It can happen, right? And it's even fairly likely that maybe two of these crises would happen in close succession, right? Like this small group manages to overthrow the empire of whatever, and then this group that's been in the wings and was like, well, right now the empire is too stuck in, not too dug in, too well dug in, and we just aren't willing to risk ourselves on this kind of possible overthrow. But then when they see that this other group has succeeded, they're like, well, this group hasn't dug its way in yet. They're still new. And so now it's time for us, who've been waiting in the wings, to go after them. It's pretty easy to get away with having two of these crises in relatively short succession, right? But the problem is that if you try to do it a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, a sixth time, you end up in this situation where, just from the perspective of this world that you're building, something crazy is happening every 5 years now. And it's like the whole society is getting overthrown, or at least being attempted, credibly attempted to be overthrown every 5 years. And there was 1,000 years of tyranny, but peaceful tyranny beforehand, right? It becomes hard to believe that this kind of thing is just happening over and over again, especially since by the second or third consecutive crises, probably all those groups have either sided with each other and grouped up to try to win things out, or or they've been exterminated, basically. The problem with especially the problem with starting a story with an epic story is that if you start epic, it becomes very hard to back down later on. You might have trouble making that back down stay interesting. It might be very hard to write your next, after writing this incredibly climactic epic story, it might be difficult to have your next book be about the next 40 generations learning to and ruling over this area, or maybe giving up some of their powers and people going off to be free and kind of having their own things going on. The stakes become much lower for a while. At least by presumption. The average world is not constantly getting thrown over and over and over and over again, because if it were, then it'd be very hard for anybody to have this kind of long 1,000-year empire. It'd be very hard to justify any group being like, well, we're the ones that are going to finally do it because, and when we do it, we'll figure it out and it'll work out. There'd be like, well, it's not going to work out. There's just going to be another group and another group and another group, and having the good guys win even a majority of those times starts to become exceedingly unlikely, right? Let's assume that that's like flipping a coin, right? You might get head twice in a row. You might get heads 3 times in a row, maybe 4. But if you keep flipping that coin, you're going to get a tails eventually. Constant high stakes in a world is kind of unlikely, and for the reader, at least for me, it can be kind of exhausting. It's like, okay, cool, they overthrew the thing. I don't need to read any more of this. We've seen the big climactic battle, and there's not much else for me to worry about. If there is, then I'm not going to worry about it too much, and maybe I'll read it some other day. Again, the problem is that most writers don't want to talk about how the next, 40 generations kept the peace and managed the government until the next crisis. So the writer is encouraged, just by market forces, to kind of contrive crisis after crisis after crisis, and it just gets hard to believe, to me at least. One series that does a pretty good job of this, I think, that I've been reading recently is the Foundation series. There are these crises, but there are typically decades between these crises, right? Typically, the crises are not actually that big in scale. Like, crisis number 1 was a few outer parts of the Galactic Empire kind of separating off to become their own kingdom and threatening the Foundation. That was like crisis number 1, effectively. These crises are limited in scope. I mean, it gets even worse if you think about like Marvel movies or something like that, where where twice a year, right, some thing comes out and threatens to destroy the whole multiverse. It gets very hard to go back to something like a dialogue-driven 12 Angry Men style movie after that happens 10 or 15 times. And once it's happened 10 or 15 times, you're like, oh, wait a minute. If the good guys lose once, everything's done, right? I made the early example of like this 1,000-year empire, but there's people who are even more guilty of this than people who make these 1,000-year empires that get toppled all of a sudden. There's these people that are like, well, the universe is in danger. The universe is in danger. The universe is in danger. And it gets kind of funny to me after the third or fourth time that there's the third or fourth consecutive universe danger that appears. It's like, if the universe danger side wins once, then this whole thing ends forever. And so either this thing ends forever pretty soon, or it just becomes increasingly unlikely that the good guys win every single time. Because, if you think of it as like a war between the good guys side that wants the universe to continue to exist, and the bad guys side, every war is going to have some skirmishes that kind of go each way. You don't expect the good guys to win every time. You expect in a rational setup for the bad guys to have their occasional victory. And oftentimes those victories are either made not an actual thing that happened, after the fact, like, oh yeah, we reversed all that, or they're of such small importance or that they don't do anything effectively to the rest of the world, or they do something to like a separate universe, and then there's all kinds of goofy stuff there. And just having looked at this over the past few years, one of the things I wanted to avoid in my first novel was kind of making up this extremely high stakes situation. And like the part of the solution that I came up with was to have relatively low stakes, but to make those stakes very personal. The pursuit of the heliotrope, which I don't think it's the pursuit of the heliotrope. I think it's just pursuit of the heliotrope. Is a story where the lives of about 24 people are on the line. Many of these 24 people directly appear in the story. Many of them have lines. Many of them have interactions with other members of the 24 group. And it's not very high stakes. It's just, 20 people or something like that, approximately. And the question is, how many of them are going to make it out? Are they going to, make it out, in significant numbers? Are people who weren't necessarily in danger going to put themselves in danger. Why are they putting themselves in danger? Is it from a sense of duty? Is it from just getting paid? Is it from wanting to test their skills? Is it from being motivated by being angered by the actions of the bad guys, right? The bad guys themselves, their lives are at stake too, right? Are they all going to make it out? Are they all going to make it out? Are some of them not? Who will? Who won't? Who's on? Are there any double agents? Are there any people who, for one reason or another, have gone from one side to the other? And if so, why? And so the stakes are pretty low in a galaxy with admittedly hundreds of populated planets over several tens of thousands of explored star systems. 24 people and 1, 2, 3, 4 ships is really kind of a drop in the bucket. They could all accidentally make it through a navigational error, crash into a planet, and probably no one would notice, or almost nobody would notice. At the same time, the antagonists in the story are one small part of a larger problem that isn't fixed by the story, or even really attempted to be fixed in the story. It's the problem of piracy, fringes, robbers and murderers on the fringes of civilization, kind of plying their trade. The goal of the people in my story is not to end all, space piracy forever. It's to find and deal with this particular group, and they end up maybe dealing with a few more, but at the same time, they don't have any lofty goals of saving the universe from a pretty natural behavior of humanity. Another thing that I tried to do to keep the stakes low but personal is to make sure that my characters are all skilled and competent, but don't have any special powers. I've read stories where they can be very fun, but they rely on the fact that one or a small number of characters have these special powers, right, that enable them to do things that nobody else can do. And sometimes those powers are super rare, and sometimes those powers are not as rare as you think, and yet somehow these guys were the ones that managed to finally do the big thing. Both of these can be a little bit troubling because one of them kind of gives you this feeling of there's this big fate of the universe thing going on where, this one person with this particular special power was fated to solve this particular problem and more problems down the line kind of thing. And the whole thing becomes kind of, a little too mythological for me. So my characters, none of them have special powers, but each of them is good at least one thing, right? They are skilled, they are competent, they are intelligent, they are professional, and when there's a problem that arises, they will generally try their best to figure out how to solve it, but none of them has some special insight where there's this particular problem that we have, and it's a big problem and we got to deal with it, and someone just raises their hand and I can fix this in 5 minutes. There's none of that. If there's something to be fixed, it's going to take time, it's going to take some thought, it's going to take some ingenuity, and sometimes they're good enough to kind of, almost pull off a miracle, at least from the perception of someone else, but it always takes material, it always takes time, and it's never something where where they're oh yeah, I just know how to fix this offhand. There's always examination, there's always investigation. Another thing that I tried to do was a lot of stories kind of try to drum up this kind of I think melodrama is too strong a word. Fair. But there's this kind of forced drama where characters that are ostensibly have been working together for a long time often kind of either have personality traits that cause them to bicker constantly, or they'll choose these weird inopportune times to kind of suddenly get angry at the other person that they're working with. All of my characters are not just skilled and competent, but they're professional, and they discuss problems rather than argue them, with the exception of like the good guys versus the bad guys. Fair enough. Another thing that I mentioned is that, like, yeah, you have this crisis, and then 3 years later you have this another crisis, and then 3 days later you have another crisis. One of the things that I do in this book, in Pursuit of the Heliotrope, that kind of it's reminiscent of like Nero Wolfe books, is that there's kind of an indeterminate amount of time since the last story. It's not that, we don't start with them talking about, we just got back from the adventures of the previous novella, Missed Contact, check it out. But instead they're talking about some other job that they did that I haven't written a story about, because it was really kind of an uninteresting job. And the only reason that they're worried about this job when the book starts up is because the guy who hired them is being a jerk about, like, I really need all those receipts in order to pay you. And they're like, oh my God, really? And then they're like, well, crap. I think we lost some of that paperwork. It was weeks ago, and I don't know where it went. Maybe it's hidden in a pile of papers over here, and we got to figure this crap out. A very mundane problem for a business owner, basically. Moreover, you'll see a lot of these stories where they try to, in one book, cover like the entire lifetime of a character. Like someone is, a little kid, and the little kid finds out that they have like a hint of a special power, and then that kid, we have to go through the whole arc of that kid growing up and being trained and joining the resistance group and executing this whole thing all in one book, right? And you end up with these books that not only are they really long, like they're just chonkers, right? But at the same time, they also like skip large quantities of time, to time where supposedly interesting things are happening. In Pursuit of the Heliotrope, on the other hand, this book only covers about a week of real time. And they talk about having jobs every couple of weeks, kind of, in various places where like, oh yeah, we had this job 2 weeks back, and then when they finish this job, they're like, oh yeah, a couple days later we had to go do this, that kind of thing. And most of their jobs are, kind of unremarkable. And so you don't get stories about them other than like a little line here and there about how dumb the guy that they were working for was sometimes, or how weird the problem that they had to deal with was, but, they eventually figured it out, kind of thing. The characters are professionals at the start of the story, and they are still professionals at the end of the story. And while they've had some tests of their skills, they're not necessarily like, they didn't necessarily like change their whole perspective on life in one book. That, I think, would be biting off more than I want to chew, I think, is maybe the best way to put that. Another thing that you see in these kind of epic stories is this kind of either hyper-utopian or hyper-dystopian kind of setting, where, like, there's this big thing that's either really good or really bad, and people are either going to destroy the good thing or maintain the bad thing, and then, our heroes have to either protect the good thing or destroy the bad thing, kind of thing. Most of human history is not the story of hyper-utopias or hyper-dystopias. There's always been a few people here and there who wanted to create this kind of utopia, create one utopian or another, one utopia or another. And there's always groups of people that end up creating these really bad organizations that are somewhat dystopian, and sometimes they can get really big and, maybe even threaten the whole world, kind of thing. But the majority of human history is on a much smaller scale than that. And, most people don't actually have the ability to do anything about these hyper-utopias or hyper-dystopias if they are around. And so one thing that I did in my book, in Pursuit of the Heliotrope, is make sure that I have human people, that's redundant, like human-sized people dealing with human-sized problems, right? We have, a group of people trying to find a receipt that they lost. We have a group of people that have been asked to check out a lifeboat that has appeared. We have, a group of people that that towed that lifeboat to a stop, and they have a report that they gave to somebody else. We have a security company that protects people in various situations, being hired on to kind of search for traps and things like that. We have one man looking through a ship and seeing if he can find any booby traps, kind of thing. There's no world in need of saving. It's just these 24 people who, some of them need to be saved and some of them need to save themselves while saving the other group, kind of thing. There's no empire that needs to be toppled. There's no utopia that's in danger of collapsing. There's no, king that's, in fear of being assassinated. Yeah, and yet at the same time, the characters are the kinds of people who have the kind of, what would you call it, like moral wherewithal that, if such a situation arose, they would probably do their best to save the world if it needed saving. Instead, they're focusing their efforts and their skills and their competence onto much smaller scale problems, which make those things a little bit more manageable, but also, interesting because the scale is smaller and they have to be like, well, actually, what is the problem here? What do you need to fix here? Kind of thing. What's our next step in this plan? How do we avoid bad things happening to these people that we're trying to save? Another thing that you often see in these kind of like really heavy epic stories is a lot of characters that are either from like the real top tippity top of the social ladder or the very, very bottom. It's usually some kind of, it's often some kind of like, the cliche, right, is a prince who is deposed from his position and raised by commoners, kind of thing, right? And then he ends up going to fight the king and the nobility in their positions, in their lofty positions later on. And then you end up with all these things of either the author will try to kind of manipulate the audience into believing that, oh, well, this group's really bad because, and that's how they got on tap, or this group is, really good, and the reason that they're oppressed is because they're good, kind of thing. It adds a little too much, I think, of it's too simplistic, I guess. It fails to acknowledge that sometimes, the people on top get there for good reasons. Sometimes people on bottom get there for reasonable reasons as well. Whether we pity them or help them or, disdain them because of whatever character flaws they might or might not have is kind of up to us. And that's kind of where I wanted to think about stuff. Like, all the characters in this book, in Pursuit of the Heliotrope, are like, kind of somewhere, somewhere in the middle of kind of like the social ladder, if you will. There's no, rank pulling. We're like, I am the authority because I am, the Duke of this particular star system, blah, 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 blah. We have a company of people who are salvagers. They have a good reputation, but salvagers often have bad reputations. So they have a good reputation among salvagers, but salvagers often are seen as kind of shady. We have a security company that does a lot of work for people who have a lot of money or have a lot of status, but they also, if you pay them, will do work for people that, don't have all that money or status. We have, good corporations and bad corporations. We have pirates that are not, just like, relegated to the bottom of society. And the people who are, going up against the pirates, or pickers as they usually are in the story, don't see them as necessarily scum, even though they do bad things sometimes. They recognize that, they're kind of in bad situations sometimes, and a lot of them are on the run from something, but more often than not, they try to avoid violence if they can, kind of thing. There's a small minority of pickers that prefer to be violent, and we're dealing with one of those groups here, but they're interacting with groups of people who, maybe are guilty of stealing things or something like that, but they're not all gone, I guess, is the way to put it. There's some interesting character interactions there with some of that, some gray market stuff, and I enjoyed that very much. The last thing I wanted to talk about Pursuit of the Heliotrope and about the Derelict Project series in general is that I have kind of a very, I think, unique take on how justice works in this universe that I've created. The focus, generally speaking, of seeking justice in the Derelict Project universe is more on fixing what was broken, saving someone who was taken or someone who's in trouble, rather than the focus being on punishing or getting back at the people who did the bad thing. There is sometimes punishment that makes its way to these people, and rightly so. They've done horrible things. But at the same time, a lot of them get away with things, either because the focus was on rescuing the hostages, and therefore it's just well, we're done. Mission successful. Let's get the hell out of here, kind of thing. Or, and this is something that I did in the first novella, the Hyacinth Rescue, which is I figured out who the criminal was, but I don't have any evidence. I don't have any way to get evidence. So what can I say? I just got to make sure I'm not ever with them alone in a room with them, and not much else I can do. I think if you're used to that kind of punish the bad guys, get revenge on the people who've wronged you, kind of plot cliche or plot element, that you'll find my perspective on justice and people kind of often getting away with it in the Derelict Project stories, at least the first one and this one. I think you'll find it a little interesting to grapple with. At least I hope so. So, final thoughts. If you want to write a story that has some kind of epic arc, go for it. Hell yeah, right? Friggin' do it. If you're capable of doing it, do it. But it's important to remember that epics have to be built over time. It might make sense to start out at low scale and move your way up. And maybe someday I'll come up with a great epic story that these characters will get into, some crazy adventure where they're on some long-term journey with some really high stakes. Maybe. But most of what they do, and most of what normal people do in the world, is kind of just getting by day to day. And it can be fun to create a world where you kind of look at some of the stuff that they do from day to day and figure out, what their personal issues are, what their personal problems are, and how they deal with those over a period of time. And from that, you can build up some really interesting and layered characters that can then go through these, crazy epic arcs on these crazy heroic journeys. But like I said, epics need to be built, and they have to be built from small things. And if you try to shortcut that process, you often end up with something that feels epic, but also feels a little bit hollow. My goal has always been to make sure that with my characters, that you know them beforehand. And if they change, then you know them afterward as well. And that there's going to be a good reason for that change to happen. Rather than, and I'm going to do it over multiple stories. There was a little bit of serendipity, right? Where in the first book I talked about Lou being afraid of vacuum, and so he's always got his helmet nearby and he never leaves it alone. And I actually managed to make that into an interesting plot point in Missed Contact. And so, my goal has been to create characters that you get to know a little bit more bit by bit from story to story. And this is certainly the most epic adventure that they've been on that I've written about so far, right? The other two stories are novellas, 25,000-ish words, as opposed to this one, which is closer to 80. And so, remember that if you want someone to believe your epic story, or if you as a reader want to think about whether a story really accomplishes being epic or not, think about these arcs. Think about, the training or conflicts or situations that they have to go through the book. Watch out for, if you're a writer, watch out for doing this, or if you're a reader, watch out for seeing this, that the writer or the author is trying to kind of cram these intros and full arcs into one short book or into one small part of a book, right? Because, if you want to start from 1,000-year empire and you want to collapse it by the end of the book, you have to have your whole arc in the first half, and then your scheme for the overthrow of the empire has to be in the second half, kind of thing. And that can be done well, but at the same time, it's very easy to neglect the little bits of character and little bits of setting that make that kind of thing feel plausible. So, that's all I've got for today. Lesson number 2 from my first novel. I'm not sure what I'm going to title this one. I have on my notes here the parenthesis misguided ? Pursuit of epicness, and I wonder if that's perhaps a little bit too loud of a title, but I'll think about it a little bit as I do the editing and uploading, and we'll see what we come up with. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I've got links in the description if you want to take a look at any of my books. There are samples available wherever it is that you happen to like them. And we have Amazon and non-Amazon options for anybody who, has any particular preference. And so, that's what I've got for today. And I'll see you next time. I'm probably going to write something, or not write something, but do something about Raymond Feist. I think I've done one little video where I talked about him, because me and Justin on the Wordy Pair talked about him. But I think I'm going to try to do some reviews of his books. I want to go back and reread books that I've read many times and maybe do some reviews of those, because I've been neglecting them, I think, with reading all this new stuff that I've never read before, which is fun, but at the same time, I feel like I should give some attention to the stuff that I've really enjoyed over a long period of time. So, as always, thanks, and see you next time. Have a good rest of your week, and, well, hopefully I'll have another video up later this week. See ya!